Hi everyone, welcome to video 2 for the Rose Gathered Shoulder Bag. We're going to start the exterior assembly, and I'm going to follow the sequence of steps in the pattern as closely as possible. So we're going to start by making our side ties. So take one of your side ties. Now mine doesn't have a right side, wrong side, but if your fabric does, then you want it to be wrong side facing up right now. And you're going to start by folding in one of the shorter ends about ½ inch towards the wrong side, and do that on the opposite end as well. And then you're going to fold it in half, wrong sides together, the entire length, and press. I'm not going to show you the pressing it along the entire length, but you're doing that along the entire length. Then you're going to open it up, and you should see a center crease now. You're going to fold in 1/2 towards the center crease, wrong sides together again, and press it. And then you do the same for the other half. Now, if you don't feel like doing this, you can actually use prepared bias binding, the double fold, and that will save you a lot of work. And then I fold in half again along that original crease that we pressed. And then you should end up with a strap piece that's 4 layers thick. And then you'll just go over to your machine and you're going to sew all the way around. It would be like slightly less than a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, just because it's so narrow. It's just ½ an inch wide. So you're going to sew all the way around once you're finished pressing. And then you do the same thing for your second tie. My side ties are done. I just wanted to show you. Hopefully you can see this, the stitching. All right, so I'm just going to set these aside because we won't need them until the very end. Now, take your O-ring connector piece. And if you're using fabric, you're going to press it instead of sew it like what I'm going to be doing. So start by on the wrong side. I just draw a line down the center on the wrong side. Now, if you're using fabric, you're going to fold in each of the outside edges in towards that center line, and you're going to press them flat. If you're using cork or vinyl like I am, then you're not going to press it, obviously. You're going to go over to your machine and you're going to fold and then sew as you're folding. And you're going to sew with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance from the center all the way down, and then when you get to the end, you rotate and then fold again, and then sew again all the way until you reach the opposite end. Again, 1/8 of an inch seam allowance from the center line. So I've sewn the connector piece in towards the center, wrong sides together, and then hopefully you can see, but there's the 2 lines of stitching holding both halves down. Now we need to cut this piece. It's 12 inches right now, so we need to get 4 connectors out of this one piece. So we're going to cut it into 3-inch pieces. And then I'm going to get my O-rings and my clips. And you're going to wrap one O-ring around one connector through each O-ring, and make sure that you have the raw edges in the center. They're going to be hidden inside of the layers of the connector. And you're going to do the same for all 3. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch the connector closed as far up as I can get towards the O-ring, because then it prevents it from just flopping around. It keeps it in a nice position when you're carrying the bag. So you're going to start at one corner, and I'm sewing with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance from the edge of the connector here. You backstitch, sew up as close as you can comfortably get to the O-ring, keeping in mind if you're using a presser foot that's really wide, you're not going to be able to sew as close to the O-ring as possible. So I use a narrower presser foot, and then I try to get as close as I can, and then I rotate and sew across, and then I rotate again and sew along the other edge here, and then I backstitch. So I'll be doing that with all 4 of these connectors, and then we'll be able to sew our shoulder straps. All 4 connectors are ready, and I'm going to try to show you the stitching close up so you see that I've sewn them so that they're closed here. Now take one of your shoulder strap pieces, and you're going to need 2 of your O-rings, and we're going to start same as we did with the connectors. We're going to draw a line on the wrong side along the center, along the entire length of the strap. And this is just to make sure that we're folding equally towards the center. Now we're going to pass 2 of the O-rings onto the shoulder strap. Okay, so now I have the wrong side of the strap facing up. This is the wrong side here with the line. And I'm going to clip the shorter ends together. And then I'm going to go over to my machine, and I'm going to sew them together with 1/2 an inch seam allowance, and I'm backstitch at the beginning and the end. And then I'm going to open up the seam allowance, and I'll top stitch along both sides of that seam with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so the shorter ends of the shoulder strap piece are sewn together. I opened up the seam allowance and I top stitch along both sides. So you should now have a loop with the 2 O-ring connectors. Now I'm going to switch the camera over to my machine because I want to show you how I do this. If you're using fabric, you can just press the halves in towards the center, same as you would have done for the O-ring connectors. If you're using cork or vinyl like I am, you actually have to fold and sew as you're going. So I'll switch the camera over just so you can see very quickly how I do this. So when I'm sewing this type of strap, I always start where I have the join, where I've joined the shorter ends together, and I just flip it. I flip the one side, wrong sides together. I fold it in towards the center. I keep my needle in the down position when I'm doing this, and I'm sewing the strap half down with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance from that center line. And I just continue doing this until I've sewn 1/2 of the loop. And then as I'm getting close to the rings, I usually have to push the O-ring connectors out of my way. So I'm just folding and sewing all the way around the loop. So I'm going to go ahead and finish that. When I've done one side, I just turn it over and then I sew down the second side until I have a strap loop that's 1 inch wide. And then I'll show you how we close that up to hide the raw edges at the center. Now, one little trick that I have here is when I get back to the start, like I'm almost done sewing the one half of my strap. So when I get to where I started sewing, I actually, instead of backstitching, I actually overlap my stitches for a bit. And then I let my needle stop exactly at the seam where I've joined the shorter ends of the strap piece. And then I rotate. And then I flip this over. So now I have the raw edges meeting each other at the center here. And then I sew across right at the seam so that you can't see the stitching from the right side of the strap. And then I can rotate and continue sewing the second side of the strap without actually having any back stitching or like stopping and starting the stitching. Like you can't see it because it's hidden inside this seam here. So now I'm going to finish sewing the other half of the strap down. You should now have a 1-inch strap. It's 1 inch wide, and you'll see there along this side, this is where we have our raw edges. So I want to transform this loop into one closed strap. So I'm going to turn it so that the raw edges are now facing each other. And where you have the seam, you can place that wherever you like. I like to put it close to one of the O-rings, maybe about 2 inches away. Okay, and then use clips, or even with like clips, sometimes they can be a little bit of shifting. So if you have double-sided tape, you can actually put a strip of double-sided tape. Just don't go all the way to the ends where you're going to be sewing. And then glue the strap loop down so that you then have a flattened piece of strap like this, and the raw edges are hidden in the middle of all the layers. So I'm going to just clip this. And once you have it all clipped in place, you're going to sew all the strap layers together to close the loop, so you don't have a strap loop anymore. You can start wherever you like, but you're going to be sewing along these outside edges with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. And when you get to an O-ring, you're going to stop, you're going to rotate and sew as close as you can to the O-ring across the strap, and then continue along the other side. So you should end up with a giant rectangle box of stitching when you're done. Here's one of the completed shoulder straps. So you'll have to do the same thing with the second shoulder strap piece and the 2 remaining O-ring connectors. And then what we're going to do is we're going to work on our flap closure. So if you're using a magnetic snap, you'll want to get that ready now. If you're using a turn lock, get your turn lock pieces ready, as well as whatever interfacing you're going to be using, and your 2 flap closure pieces. I'm just going to pause and get my my turn lock and my magnetic snap so that I can explain the differences. Okay, so if you're using a magnetic snap, you're going to have these 2 pieces that fit together plus 2 washers. And if you're using a magnetic snap, you should have cut out a piece of fusible fleece, and it should be fused to the wrong side of one of your flap closure pieces. I do recommend trimming the seam allowance from the fleece before you fuse it to the wrong side. If you're using fabric, you should have also put the fusible woven interfacing on the wrong side before you put the fusible fleece. I'm using cork, so I don't need to interface it like that. I'm also going to be doing the turn lock, so I'm going to need, this is stiff stuff, but you can also use Peltex or something similar. Now you'll want to take, for your magnetic snap, you're going to, first of all, you're going to need the pattern piece. So I will find my pattern piece, and then we're going to transfer the location of the mark for either the turn lock or the magnetic snap. It's in the same location. It's exactly the same. So for my tab closure, my flap closure pattern piece, I actually used a hole punch and I punched out the location of the magnetic snap or the turn lock, which just makes it easier to transfer the mark to my flap closure piece. I'm going to use white so that you can see it on my black cork. Now, if you're using a magnetic snap, you're going to install the male half, so the one that has a little bit sticking out. You're going to install this part into the flap, and you should have your fleece here to make the area where you're installing the snap stronger. You're going to use one of the washers and you're going to place it over top, and the washer should have a center circle hole, so you put that right over top of your the mark that you made, and then mark the location of the prong holes on either side of that center mark, and then carefully cut those out. If you're using fabric, you want to apply fray check to the holes that you cut out, and then you're going to push the prongs of your snap, this half of your snap, through those holes from the right side, flip it over, and then you place the washer over the prongs, spread the prongs to secure them. Now, if you're using a turn lock like I am, you need to get the part of your turn lock that has the front plate and the back plate with the little screws. This is the part you're going to be installing here on the flap. And I'm going to have to get my screwdriver, which I believe I don't have here. Okay, so I'm going to pause. I'll get my screwdriver. And what you're going to do is you're going to remove the back plate, because the back plate is what you're going to be using to transfer the holes to the right side of your flap closure piece. So let me get my screwdriver and I'll show you that. Okay, so I'm just going to take off the back plate and I'll show you how the back plate actually makes the perfect template for marking what holes you should be cutting for the installation. Now, the main difference here between the magnetic snap closure and the turn lock closure is that before you sew the flap closure pieces together, if you're using a magnetic snap, you need to install the half into one piece only. But if you're using a turn lock, you're actually going to make the mark, but then sew the pieces together first, because we have to actually make a hole through all of the layers of the flap for a turn lock. So now that I have my mark, and if you're using a turn lock, now's the time that you're going to sew them together. So right after you've made a mark. Okay, and you're not sewing around all the sides of the flap. You're just going to sew around this side, the curved bottom side, and this side. You have to leave this open for turning. Okay, so leave this top straight edge has to be left unsewn. You're going to start here, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch, go down to the corner, rotate, so across the curved bottom, rotate again up to the top, and then back stitch. And you use 3/8 of an inch seam allowance to sew these two pieces together. Okay, so the flap pieces are sewn together, and hopefully you can see the stitching here all the way around. Now you want to trim that seam allowance a little bit to maybe 1/8. Don't get too close to the stitches. And then here at the corners, you kind of have to trim away as much as you can, because when you turn it right side out, you want those corners to look nice and sharp. Okay, now if you're using fabric, this is going to be way easier to turn, but with cork it's a little bit harder just because the opening is narrower at the top. Use something to poke this out. Okay, I need to get something longer. I like to use the handle of a paintbrush. You could use a chopstick as well if you don't have a fancy turning tool. Okay, and then I gently poke out the corners. And we're going to top stitch this flap now. We're going to top stitch all the way around. However, before we do that, that's where we're going to use this piece. So because I'm using cork, I can't really press the seams, so I like to roll it and then I just add clips and it sort of presses itself that way a little bit. Now we're going to insert this in between the layers of the flap, but before we do that, obviously this is original size, so it's way too big. We have to trim away, I trim away about 1/2 inch all the way around. So there's my flap, and you can see my mark here where I'm going to install my lock. So I'm going to trim away about 1/2 inch on all the sides. And then I'm going to stick it in there in between all the layers. Okay, so I just put it over top, make sure it's going to fit. I think I should trim just a tiny bit more. You'll have to trim away more or less depending on the material you're using. I'm using cork, it's a little bit thicker, so I have to trim away a little bit extra. Okay, so now I'm going to stick this inside. I kind of roll it because it's wider here. And then I try to get it in there all the way to the end. You might have to use, again, like a chopstick or something similar so that you can get the ends all the way into the corners. Make sure it's sitting nice and flat inside. And then once you're happy with the fit, I'll actually use the clips again to hold it in place. And then you're going to go over and top stitch with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way to the end. If you trim too much away and you don't think the top stitching will sew through the interfacing that you put in, then you can use a larger seam allowance, maybe a 1/4 inch. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and do my top stitching. I've top stitched my flap, and now I'm going to use the back plate of my lock, and I'm going to center the mark in the middle of the largest opening at the center of my back plate. Now, depending on what kind of lock you're using and what shape it is, you're going to be drawing a different shape. Now you want to draw the shape for the largest part in the center, but also where you're going to need holes for the screws. Now I'm worried that my pen is not working, and I'm right. There we go. So I apologize, you're not going to be able to see my marks very well, but I do have the one larger mark for the center hole and then 2 smaller marks for the holes for the screws. I'm going to go get my hole punch and my hammer, and I'm going to cut out the hole. Okay, so I bought this little set of punches. There are all sorts of different shapes to install different types of locks. And one of them happens to be the same shape as the opening of my lock. So I'm going to use this punch to punch the hole. I'm going to mute the sound of this part just so that you don't hear me hammering. It's probably very annoying on video. So I will do this part, but I will mute it. Okay, so what I've done, the hole wasn't exactly big enough for the opening, so I made it a little bit bigger than the size of my punch here. And then I just check with my lock to make sure that it'll fit in the opening. For the holes on either side, for the screw, I actually use a rotary hole punch. And I just get in there and punch the holes for my screws using this. And then again, I just check to see if it fits. That's quite good. Okay, that should work. So now what I'm going to do, I'll get my glue and I'll just put a little bit of glue here and inside the screw holes because I really want the lock to stay in place. So I will get my glue and add some glue. So I just added a bit of glue and then I put on my back plate and then I screw it all together. Make sure your screws are in real tight. And then there we go. We have our plate. And if you want to protect your lock during the rest of the construction of the bag, you can actually cover it with tape. And then I just remove it at the end. So we're going to set that aside, and I'm going to stop the exterior assembly here, and then we'll complete it in the next video.